Hello, friends. The terrifying story you're about to hear isn't fiction. Let's begin. My name is Ethan Miller, and I'm 32 years old. If you're hearing or reading this, understand one thing. I am not crazy. I know what I saw, what I felt, and what happened in that house. I spent 2 years trying to rationalize it, to file it away under stress, or hallucination, or the natural decay of an old structure. But none of those explanations ever fit. They were comfortable lies I told myself when the lights were on. This is the truth, unfiltered and ugly. And I'm telling it because I need someone to know, just in case. I need this to be real, grounded in the world, because the alternative, that I faced something truly unknown and ancient, is simply too terrifying to bear alone. My story starts, as all cliché horror stories do, with an inheritance. A remote property left to me by my great-aunt Clara, whom I'd met exactly once as a child. She died alone in the spring, and I, a freelance researcher and writer burnt out from city life in Boston, saw it as a sign, a chance to reset, to find peace, and most importantly, to write that book I'd been putting off. The house, nestled deep in the coastal woods of northern Maine, was called the Saltwood, a fittingly grim name for a place surrounded by pine and perpetually damp air. I arrived in late October. The air was already biting, carrying the sharp, metallic smell of the ocean mixed with the thick, earthy rot of the forest floor. The Saltwood wasn't grand. It was stubbornly, aggressively ordinary, which made its unsettling atmosphere all the more potent. A 2-story farmhouse, graying clapboard siding, a porch that sagged like an old man's spine, and windows that looked like tired eyes. It was set back from a barely paved road by a 1/4 mile of overgrown driveway. No immediate neighbors. Nothing but trees and silence. I remember thinking, as I wrestled my heavy suitcase out of my beat-up sedan, that the silence was the heaviest thing of all. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of nothingness, a suffocating vacuum where chirping birds and distant traffic ought to have been. The first few weeks were mundane, which was exactly what I craved. I unpacked, set up my makeshift office in a sunroom that thankfully faced the dense woods rather than the oppressive front yard, and tried to establish a routine. The plumbing groaned, the electrical wiring flickered with a life of its own, and the furnace clanked like a ghostly drummer. I chalked it all up to age. Everything in that house was 70 years old, at least. Every creak was a beam settling. Every draft was a poorly sealed window. Every sudden drop in temperature was the weather turning. This was my mantra. I repeated it hundreds of times. The trouble started subtly, a slow leak of unease into my carefully constructed isolation. The first definite instance was the smell. It wasn't a bad smell, not initially. It was a faint, clean scent, like ozone or a freshly extinguished match, but mixed with something else, something mineral, like old iron or damp soil. It would appear late at night, often around 2 or 3 a.m., always in the hallway between my bedroom and the main staircase. I'd wake up, not from a sound, but from the sudden, sharp clarity of the air, a chemical clean shock to the nostrils. I searched for leaks, checked the attic for dead animals, and even replaced the smoke detector batteries, convinced it was some sort of electrical short. But the smell was always gone by dawn. Then came the documents. I was down in the basement, a dank, rough-hewn space with a dirt floor and stone walls, looking for the main fuse box. The basement felt wrong, not evil, just unwilling. It resisted my presence. Against the far wall, Obscured by a century of cobwebs and a few forgotten paint cans, I found a small iron safe embedded halfway into the stone. It wasn't a bank safe. It was an old home lockbox, rusted shut. I spent 3 days chipping away the surrounding mortar and rust, finally prying it open with a borrowed crowbar. Inside, there were no jewels or gold, just a stack of journals, bound in cracking leather, and a series of meticulously rendered maps. The journals belonged to Clara's father, Silas Thorne, who had owned the house before her. Silas was not a sentimental man. His entries were spare, almost clinical, detailing the local weather, crop yields, and property maintenance. Until 1957. That year, the tone shifted. He wrote less about the garden and more about the well. The house had an old well, capped with concrete out by the woodshed. November 4th, 1957. The soil around the well is not settling properly. Too much moisture, even after a week without rain. The ground feels spongy. I hear the water at night now. Not dripping. It's a rhythmic, low sound, like it's breathing. November 17th, 1957. My headaches are constant. The doctor calls it stress. I call it the sound. It's coming up through the floor, a constant low thrum that I can't quite isolate. It's not the house. It's below the house. I tried digging a small trench near the capped well. The earth is the color of old blood, and it smells of iron and the ozone. The entries grew erratic, filled with sketches, not of the house, but of patterns. Complex, geometric shapes that looked less like symbols and more like circuit diagrams for something organic. He never finished the last journal. The final page, dated February 3rd, 1958, simply had one word, scrawled repeatedly until the ink bled through the page. Drain. 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 I didn't find a note, an explanation, or a mention of where Silas went. He simply stopped writing. This discovery did two things. It provided a rational focus for my fear, the history of the house, and it simultaneously amplified the terror, proving that someone else, 70 years earlier, had noticed the same disturbing patterns. I wasn't just hearing an old house, I was hearing the same thing Silas had heard. From that day on, the silence was replaced by that thrum. It was in the walls, the floorboards, sometimes even in my pillow. It was infrasound, I told myself. A low-frequency resonance from the environment, or a geological anomaly. I bought sound-dampening headphones, but they didn't help. The thrum didn't seem to travel through the air. It traveled through the bone. It felt like my internal organs were vibrating slightly out of sync. The maps were even more disturbing than the journals. They were meticulous surveys of the property, not just of the trees and fences, but of the depths. Layer upon layer of geological cross-sections, annotated with bizarre, non-standard symbols. On one map, dated 1956, Silas had clearly marked the capped well. But on the 1957 map, he had added a second, unlabeled point directly beneath the foundation of the house, in the center of the basement, and written next to it, secondary pulse. I went back down to the basement immediately, notebook in hand, comparing his map to the actual space. The dirt floor was dry and packed hard, but directly where the secondary pulse was marked, the dirt looked newer, darker. I dug. It wasn't a casual dig. It was a desperate excavation, fueled by caffeine and a growing, sickening conviction. I dug for 5 hours straight, the earthy smell thickening into that metallic ozone scent Silas had described. About 4 feet down, my shovel hit something solid. It wasn't stone or bedrock, it was wood. Treated, heavy oak planks laid flat, forming a sort of subterranean trapdoor, perfectly square, about 6 feet by 6 feet. I didn't open it then. I couldn't. The sheer implication of a secret sealed chamber directly under the oldest part of the house, linked to Silas Thorne's descent into madness and the endless thrum, froze the blood in my veins. I covered it back up with the dirt, smoothing the surface, trying to bury the secret again. But the damage was done. I knew it was there. That night, everything changed. I was sitting in my sunroom office, trying to force myself to write a dry, factual analysis of 19th century trade laws. Anything to anchor myself to reality. The thrum was louder than ever, and the ozone smell was so strong it made my eyes water. It felt like a storm was brewing, but the sky outside was clear, the moon a bright, hard disk. I heard the sound from upstairs. It wasn't a creak or a groan. It was a slide, like a heavy leather satchel being dragged across the floorboards of the empty guest room above me. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely wrong. The noise stopped directly over my head. I sat perfectly still, my hand shaking so hard, my pen rattled against my wooden desk. I forced myself up. I told myself it was a branch on the roof. I told myself it was the house settling. I told myself it was a hallucination caused by lack of sleep and too much coffee. But the sound had been too real, too textural. I walked to the stairs. The air was colder here, much colder. The kind of cold that feels heavy, not like temperature, but like pressure. The pressure of something huge displacing the warmth. I looked up the dark staircase, my phone's flashlight beam cutting a weak, dusty path. Hello? My voice was thin and reedy, swallowed instantly by the surrounding quiet. Silence. Then, a single, sharp click from the landing at the top of the stairs. It sounded exactly like the latch on the old attic access door being quietly turned. My lungs seized. I knew that door was bolted from the outside. I had checked it myself when I first moved in. I began to back away slowly, towards the kitchen, towards the back door. But as I moved, I heard a different sound from the top of the stairs. Not a slide, not a click. This was mimicry. It was the sound of my own voice, distorted and stretched thin, calling my name. Ethan. It was a whisper, a wet, drawn-out sound that vibrated with the thrum coming from the basement. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like something trying to replicate human speech by rubbing two pieces of sandpaper together. It was close enough to be recognizable, but alien enough to trigger a primal terror. I ran. Not to the front door, but into the kitchen, grabbing the closest thing I could find. A heavy, rusty fireplace poker I'd left near the unused wood stove. I stood in the center of the kitchen, heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the dimly lit doorway leading back to the hall and the stairs. The thrumming intensified, becoming a physical vibration that made the china cups in the cupboard rattle. The air pressure dropped noticeably, and the ozone scent was overwhelming, like standing next to a lightning strike. Then, at the edge of the hallway, a shape moved. It wasn't the shadowy, fleeting movement of my earlier doubts. This was defined. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet, and impossibly thin, like a stick figure wrapped in shadow. It stood stock still for a moment, and I could swear I saw the shape lean its head sideways, as if examining me. It had no distinct features, no discernible clothing, just a vertical mass of absolute darkness against the relative gloom of the hall. The lack of detail was what made it terrifying. It was a negative space that had become solid. I raised the poker, my knuckles white, ready to scream, to swing, to do anything. The shape did not move towards me. Instead, it did the single most inexplicable and terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. It reached a hand, long, spindly, and ending in something that looked like 5 sharp, jointed twigs, and deliberately scraped it across the wooden wall of the hallway. The sound was not that of wood on wood. It was the sound of metal on dry bone, a horrifying, high-pitched screech that felt like it was tearing not just the wall, but the very fabric of the house. And then, I saw the mark. A single, deep groove, running vertically up the wall, smoking faintly, as if the contact had generated intense friction. It was a declaration, a physical mark, proving that this wasn't a draft, not an electrical short, and not a dream. Something was here, and it was capable of physical interaction. I didn't wait. I bolted out the back door, slamming it behind me, and stumbled into the cold, empty backyard. I kept running until I reached my car, parked on the overgrown drive. I fumbled for the keys, heart punching against my sternum, sweat freezing on my brow. I threw the car into reverse and spun out onto the road, tires kicking up mud and gravel. I didn't slow down for 5 miles. I didn't look in the rearview mirror once. When I finally pulled over on the shoulder of the highway, shivering uncontrollably, the first thing I did was check my phone. No signal. Just the universal silence of the Maine woods. But as I sat there, trying to regain control, trying to convince myself to call the police, to call anyone, I glanced at my dashboard. I had been holding the poker so tightly that I hadn't noticed. The fireplace poker was still clutched in my hand, but it was no longer rusty iron. Where my hand met the metal itself was cold and sleek, and it was coated in a thin, glistening layer of the dark, reddish-brown dirt from the basement. The same dirt I had used to cover the trapdoor, the same earth that smelled of iron and ozone. I threw the poker onto the passenger seat and sat there for another 10 minutes, hyperventilating, the smell of damp earth and ozone now thick inside the car. I couldn't go back, but I couldn't leave. The journals, the maps, the hole in the basement, they were still there. The thing that made the sound, that scratched the wall, was still there. And I knew with a sickening certainty that it was tied to the history Silas had buried. I had opened the safe, and now I had opened the door to whatever had been waiting patiently beneath the house. I drove to the nearest town, found a cheap, fluorescent-lit motel, and paid cash. I couldn't tell the clerk what happened. I couldn't tell the police. Who would believe me? A burned-out writer moves into an old house, digs a hole in the basement, and sees a shadow monster. For the next 2 days, I stayed in that motel room, staring at the ceiling, reviewing the facts. The thrum, the ozone, Silas's journal, the secret trap door, the shadow, the scratch. They were all pieces of a cohesive, terrifying puzzle. I had to know what was under the house. The thought of it lying there, beneath the floor, pulsating with that relentless low frequency, was worse than the shadow itself. It was the origin. And I knew, deep down, that the thrum hadn't just been in the house. It had started to travel with me. Every now and then, even in the sterile environment of the motel, I could feel a faint, distant vibration in my chest. I decided I needed evidence, not for the police, but for myself. I needed to prove that my experience was physical and not purely psychological. I drove back to the Saltwood at noon on the 3rd day. The house looked different in the daylight, less sinister, more tired. I forced myself to walk inside. The air was dead and cold, and the scratch on the hallway wall was real, a jagged, deep groove in the old plaster and wood. It hadn't been a hallucination. The physical evidence solidified my resolve. I went straight to the sunroom, grabbed my camera gear, a tripod, a high-resolution camera, and a sensitive audio recorder. My plan was simple. Set up the equipment in the basement, facing the spot where I had reburied the trapdoor, and leave it running for 24 hours. Getting the equipment set up in the basement was the hardest part. Every movement felt like a violation. I set the camera to record high frame rate video with a night vision filter and placed the audio recorder, which was professional grade and designed to pick up infrasound, about 5 feet from the suspected trapdoor. I even set up a small, low-powered work light, hoping that the small amount of light would prevent whatever it was from feeling too comfortable. I did all of this in less than 10 minutes, rushing, my breathing shallow, the metallic ozone smell already starting to seep into the air. As I backed out of the basement and locked the door behind me, I felt a strange, almost magnetic pull from the ground below. It was an unmistakable sense of anticipation. Not my own, but the anticipation of whatever was beneath the trapdoor, now aware it was being watched. I climbed the stairs, went back to the kitchen, and packed a small bag. I wasn't staying. I was going back to the motel to wait and review the footage. The drive back was agonizing. Every turn of the wheel felt like I was running from an invisible predator. I got back to the motel, ordered terrible delivery pizza, and tried to sleep. But the faint thrum in my chest was constant now. It was like a metronome for terror. The next day, I drove back to retrieve the equipment. I was careful, quiet, and armed myself again with the fireplace poker, which I had thoroughly wiped clean, though the memory of the red-brown dirt clung to it like a residue. The house was silent. Absolutely silent. The usual creaks and groans were gone. The quiet felt attentive. I unlocked the basement door, took a deep breath of the stale, cold air, and quickly descended. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I grabbed the camera, the recorder, and the tripod, and rushed out, locking the door firmly behind me. I didn't look at the spot in the dirt. I didn't need to. I knew what was waiting. Back in the motel, I set up my laptop, plugged in the camera, and transferred the 24 hours of video footage. It was tedious. 24 hours of unchanging darkness, broken only by the dim, green glow of the night vision and the slow crawl of dust motes. I scrubbed through the first 12 hours quickly. Nothing. Just the slow, patient silence. Then, around 1:47 a.m. on the video timestamp, the first change occurred. The light flickered. Not a burst, but a dimming, as if the electrical current was being slowly choked. Then it returned to normal. Then it happened again, 4 minutes later. Each time, the green night vision image darkened almost to black, then stabilized. The audio, however, was immediately more informative. I put on my best headphones and played the file starting from the 1:45 a.m. mark. The background was filled with a constant, low-frequency hum, the thrum. The recorder had captured it clearly. It wasn't environmental. It was a rhythmic, incredibly deep pulse, almost too low for the human ear to register consciously. It sounded biological, but massive, like the slow, deep heartbeat of a whale in the darkest part of the ocean. At 1:47 a.m., corresponding with the first light dimming, the pulse stuttered. It dropped frequency, a sickening, momentary drag that sounded like a mechanical groan, and then it intensified. The pulse became stronger, faster, a heavy, deliberate thump-thump-thump that made the cones in my headphones vibrate painfully. Then came the second noise. Overlaying the relentless thrum, I heard a sound of friction, like fabric scraping against something rough, but deep, resonating. It was coming from below the floor. It sounded like something large was trying to move, confined by space. Like a thick, heavy body being slowly, agonizingly forced across rough stone. I looked at the video footage again. The light flickered one last time, much longer this time. When it stabilized, I saw it. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't the tall, spindly thing. It was movement in the dirt. Directly above the trapdoor, a small, dark mound of earth began to bubble. slowly and deliberately. It wasn't subtle. It looked like something was pushing up from below, causing the packed dirt to give way in slow motion. A series of tiny fissures, like miniature lightning strikes, spiderwebbed across the surface of the ground. And then, a tiny, almost imperceptible section of the dirt mound retracted. It sank back down a fraction of an inch, leaving a small, perfectly round hole, no bigger than a thumbtack head, in the center of the disturbed earth. I zoomed the video in, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see anything inside the hole. It was just a black void. But the audio recorder, placed only a few feet away, picked up the final horrifying noise. It was a slurping sound, wet, deep, and impossibly close to the microphone. It was the sound of a large organism drawing air, or perhaps moisture, from the surrounding environment. It lasted for exactly 4 seconds, a disgusting, sucking noise, and then the hole instantly and completely resealed itself, the dirt returning to a smooth, uniform surface as if nothing had happened. The thrum immediately dropped back down to its previous, slower, more controlled rhythm. The lights in the video stabilized. Silence, except for the omnipresent pulse. I paused the video, ripping the headphones off. My ears were ringing with the echo of that sound. The slurp. It was a thing of profound, unsettling biological need. Something was living, or perhaps just existing, beneath my house, using the subsoil as its hideaway. And it was capable of manipulating the lights, making noise, and briefly opening a tiny, pinpoint entry into my reality. I knew I couldn't stay in the motel. I had the evidence, the physical proof. But that proof only raised 1,000 new, more terrifying questions. What was it? What did it want? And why did Silas Thorne want to drain it? I packed up my laptop, the camera, and the recorder, and drove. Not back to Boston, not to the police. I drove to the local library in the nearby town of Port Willow, the same library Silas Thorne must have used. I needed more context. I needed to understand the geological and historical basis of the land. I needed to find out what was in the earth of the Saltwood property. I spent the next 48 hours in the library basement, surrounded by microfilm and musty local history books. I found no mention of Silas Thorne's disappearance. It had been treated as a simple walk-off, a man who abandoned his farm. But I found something much, much worse. An obscure 1922 thesis by a local geologist detailed the unique subsoil conditions of the entire coastal region. He described the land around the Saltwood property as sitting on a massive subterranean shelf of ferrous rock that caused intense magnetic and low-frequency sonic anomalies. The soil itself was rich in iron and sulfur, and the water table was unusually close to the surface, creating pockets of perpetually damp, mineral-rich mud deep underground. Then, in a book about local folklore, I found a single terrifying paragraph that made me physically ill. It was a passage referencing old Algonquin legends from the 17th century. They spoke of a sleeper in the red earth, a primordial entity that demanded silence and absorbed the warmth of the living through contact with the soil. The legend stated that when the sleeper was near the surface, the air would become clean, like ozone, and a constant low drumming would accompany it. The only way to stop it, the legend vaguely suggested, was to deny it water, to drain the land and let the sleeper dry and harden back into the ferrous rock it was birthed from. Silas hadn't been draining water. He had been trying to drain the life out of the land. That was the turning point. I realized I was fighting something that wasn't a ghost. but a geological, quasi-biological phenomenon tied to the very earth the house sat on. The thrum wasn't just a sound, it was its pulse. The ozone smell wasn't an electrical short, it was a byproduct of its strange chemical existence. The darkness wasn't a shadow, it was a hungry projection of the sleeper, seeking warmth. I had to finish what Silas started. I had to drain the land. The first step was finding a way to safely open the trapdoor and see what it was I was fighting, to truly document the truth. I needed tools, equipment, and a final, desperate plan. My research led me to a local hardware store where I bought a heavy-duty hydraulic jack, thick nylon rope, and a coil of wire. Anything I could use to secure the heavy planks and get a look into the pit. When I drove back to the saltwood this final time, the atmosphere was different. The house was no longer silent. It was angry. The low thrumming was audible even from the outside, a low, visceral growl vibrating up through the soles of my shoes. The trees seemed to lean in, heavy with the metallic, chemical scent. I parked the car far up the drive and walked the last few yards, the hydraulic jack heavy in my hands. The house waited, a black, sullen monolith against the cold, gray sky. This wasn't a story anymore. This was a confrontation. I stood in the basement, the jack braced against the stone wall, the claw of the jack resting against the edge of the covered trapdoor. The thrumming was unbearable, a physical pain in my eardrums. I started to crank the jack, slowly, carefully, listening to the groaning of the wood beneath the dirt. The ozone smell was so potent I felt lightheaded. With a final, sickening crack, the planks gave way. I dropped the jack and stumbled back, covering my mouth against the rush of air that came up from the hole. It was a hot, dense wind, smelling strongly of sulfur, ozone, and wet, ancient stone. The hole was deep, deeper than any well, and the flashlight beam couldn't reach the bottom. But the flashlight did illuminate the sides of the pit. The walls weren't brick or stone. They were lined with a thick, dark, rubbery substance that looked like petrified fungus or dried muscle tissue. And it was moving. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, timed perfectly with the pulse of the thrumming. The pit was not a well, it was a throat. And then, I heard it again. Closer, louder, and unmistakably conscious. Ethan. Warmth. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a sound that came from the pit itself. A low, resonant, multi-tonal vibration that felt like words formed out of mud and sorrow. The shadow creature I had seen before had been a warning. This was the source. I dropped my flashlight, and it tumbled down the pit, the beam rotating wildly, briefly illuminating something wet and enormous at the bottom, before it was swallowed by darkness. I ran for the stairs, knowing I had seen too much, knowing the sleeper was awake and knew my name. I didn't lock the basement door. I just hammered my way up, desperate to get back to the safety of the car. I threw open the kitchen door, turned, and froze. Standing in the hallway, at the top of the stairs leading down to the basement, was the spindly, tall shadow. It was blocking my escape. But this time, it was not just a silhouette. The darkness had texture, and at its center, where a face should have been, there was only a patch of raw, glistening red that pulsed with the light of the basement. The ozone scent was almost blinding. I stood there, breathing heavy, the fireplace poker useless in my hand. The creature raised one long, twig-like arm, pointing directly at the open basement door behind me. And then, I heard the rush of wind from below, and the heavy, sloshing sound of something huge beginning to climb. The rhythmic pulse beneath my feet became a frantic, pounding drum. The ceiling beams began to crack. I was trapped between the source and its terrifying projection. The last thing I heard before the lights went out completely was the crack of the nearest floorboard, not from the weight of the creature, but from the pressure of the earth itself giving way. I dropped the poker and braced myself for the darkness, knowing that the confrontation was finally here, and I was utterly alone with the thing that lived beneath the red earth. The world didn't just go dark, it imploded. The air, already thick with the metallic ozone scent, became suddenly heavy, a blanket of pressure slamming down on my chest. The last sound I heard, the crack of the floorboard, was less like wood splitting and more like a bone snapping under impossible strain. The thrumming in the floor exploded into a deafening, continuous roar, no longer a heartbeat, but a full, frantic seizure of the earth. In that instant of absolute, pitch-black silence from the loss of light, I was aware only of the smell. Raw sulfur, wet iron, and something else. Something warm, sticky, and profoundly organic. Like an abattoir filled with hot, living mud. I didn't think. I acted on instinct, a primitive survival reflex overriding the shock. The shadow creature, the spindly projection, was at the top of the stairs. The massive, sloshing source, the sleeper, was climbing up from the gaping pit below. I was trapped. But the kitchen, where I stood frozen, had two exits. The main hall leading to the stairs, and the back door, which I had just used. I spun around, blind, scrambling across the worn linoleum floor toward the faint outline of the back door, my boots slipping on the slick, cold tiles. I heard the slosh below me grow instantly louder, accompanied by a low, grating sound as something enormous scraped itself against the wooden frame of the basement door, which I had neglected to lock. It wasn't just climbing. It was forcing itself upward, tearing the structure of the house apart to reach the warmth. As I fumbled for the deadbolt, the spindly shadow in the hall moved. I didn't see it, but I felt the displacement of air, an impossible current of cold, passing where the creature had been standing. Then, a sharp, jointed impact struck the doorframe inches from my head. I heard the crack of wood splintering, followed by a sound like dry, sharp claws scraping the paintwork. Wasn't trying to open the door, it was trying to block me, to herd me back toward the source. I wrenched the deadbolt open, shoved the door, and burst out onto the decaying back porch. The cold night air was a shock, but even here, 10 feet from the house, the metallic odor was overwhelming, and the thrumming resonated up from the ground, like I was standing on a giant, vibrating drum. I didn't stop to assess the chaos behind me. I had to get the car. I sprinted across the overgrown lawn towards the driveway, my mind racing through the fragments of Silas's journal and the Algonquin folklore. Drain. Deny it water. Let the sleeper dry and harden. The house was its feeding ground, the pit its throat, and the deep, wet earth its heart. I had to attack the heart. I had to drain the water table. I reached the car, threw myself inside, locked the doors, and slammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over reluctantly, groaning in protest against the sudden cold demand. I glanced back at the house, and in the sliver of moonlight filtering through the pines, I saw a change. The light was still gone, but the front windows, the exhausted, tired eyes of the farmhouse, were no longer merely dark. They were reflecting a dull, interior glow, a pulsing, deep red light, like a coal fire viewed through thick smoke, seemed to emanate from the ground floor. It pulsed in perfect sync with the frantic thrumming. Whatever was climbing out of the pit had brought its own dreadful illumination. I jammed the car into gear, spinning the tires in the mud before finding purchase and roaring down the driveway. I wasn't leaving this time, not for the motel. I had a purpose now, a terrifying clarity. I was no longer a victim. I was a desperate exterminator fighting a geological abomination. I drove barely a mile down the Maine coastal road before pulling over. I needed the map and the hydraulic jack. Those were the only weapons I had against an entity made of earth and pulse. I had to risk going back. Parking behind a massive granite outcropping about half a mile from the property, I grabbed my backpack. Inside were the journals, the camera, and most importantly, Silas's final, meticulous map. I spread the map on the passenger seat, using my phone screen for light. It detailed the property, the house foundation, the central secondary pulse pit, and, crucially, the original capped well marked in a small clearing near the woodshed. Silas, the journals hinted, had tried everything inside the house. He tried to seal the pit, to use chemicals, even to build a protective boundary. He failed. The legend said, "Deny it water." The key was the well. The well was the house's old water source, a direct line into the upper water table of the surrounding ferrous soil. If I could shatter the concrete cap and use the heavy-duty pump I'd seen in the dusty shed, a relic Silas must have used for irrigation, I could start drawing the water down, potentially creating the dry earth the legend prescribed. It was a shot in the dark, a literal descent into folklore, but the alternative was letting that thing fully surface. I pulled out the heavy hydraulic jack I had purchased, along with the rope and the wire. I also grabbed a long, heavy-duty crowbar, a better weapon than the fireplace poker. My heart was a drum against my ribs, but the internal thrum, the one I had felt in my chest, seemed to have retreated, perhaps overshadowed by the massive pulse emanating from the house. I approached the house from the rear, moving slowly through the dense pines. The metallic ozone smell was still powerful, but less concentrated out here, diluted by the cold forest air. The red glow in the windows was still visible, faint but unmistakable, suggesting the creature was either slow-moving or perhaps lingering in the central area of the house, enjoying the warmth it craved. The woodshed was on the northwest side of the property, a small, sagging structure about 50 feet from the main house. I crept toward it, sticking close to the shadow of the trees. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. I reached the woodshed. It was unlatched. I slipped inside. The smell of old sawdust, mildew, and rot was thankfully normal, overpowering the ozone. I used my phone light, keeping the beam low. The shed was full of ancient tools, saws, axes, rusted garden implements, and there it was, the water pump. It was a massive, gas-powered beast, painted a faded industrial blue, connected to a thick, flexible hose coiled neatly on the dirt floor. Miraculously, the fuel tank looked almost full, a testament to Silas's meticulous, paranoid maintenance. The capped well was just outside the shed, a low, gray concrete disc blending into the leaf litter. It was thick, probably a foot or more of reinforced concrete, designed to be permanent. I needed to break it. I grabbed the heavy sledgehammer hanging on the shed wall, Silas's final tool, perhaps. I felt a surge of grim solidarity with the long-dead farmer. We were fighting the same fight, 70 years apart. I positioned myself over the cap. I raised the sledgehammer. It was incredibly heavy, and my arms trembled with the effort. I had to put everything into the first swing, not just for power, but to deny the sleeper time to react to the new noise. Crack. The sound was deafening, a high-frequency shock that tore through the thrum. The hammer bounced violently. A starburst of white spiderweb cracks appeared in the concrete, but the cap held. I raised it again, ignoring the throbbing pain in my shoulders, ignoring the way the thrumming from the house intensified instantly, vibrating the very ground beneath my feet in angry response. The red glow from the house seemed to grow brighter, casting a faint, crimson tint on the surrounding trees. Crack, crack, crack. On the fifth swing, the concrete cap exploded. A large section fractured and flipped outward. I jumped back, coughing, as a spout of cold, mineral-rich water shot up a few feet before settling back into the broken wellhead. The hole was now open, revealing dark, churning water 20 feet down. I had done it. I had opened the primary drain. Now for the hard part, getting the pump operational. I dragged the huge blue pump out of the shed. It took all my strength. I uncoiled the thick intake hose and lowered the reinforced end into the well, hearing the satisfying plunk as it hit the surface of the water. As I worked, connecting the output hose to drain downhill into the deepest part of the surrounding woods, I noticed the change in the air. The ozone and sulfur scents were receding, replaced by a pure, overwhelming scent of fresh, cold water. It was refreshing, but it felt like a direct sensory counterattack from the entity, trying to use the moisture I was seeking to deny it. The thrumming from the house was now a frantic, high-pitched wail, a sound of pure geological distress. I knelt by the pump, checked the fuel line, and found the pull cord. This was the point of no return. Starting this pump would be a declaration of war against the sleeper. I pulled the cord. Nothing. I pulled again, harder. A dry cough from the engine. I paused, breathing raggedly. I could hear the house now. No longer the quiet menace of the first night. Now, it was actively screaming. I heard glass shatter from an upstairs window, followed by a heavy grinding sound. The sound of the shadow creature, perhaps, moving through the upper floor in a state of blind, uncontrolled rage. I pulled the cord a third time, shouting over the sound of the house tearing itself apart. Vroom! The pump roared to life, a sudden, beautiful industrial sound that felt utterly foreign and alien in the context of this ancient, organic terror. It was loud, disruptive, and aggressively mechanical. The vibration of the engine fought directly against the thrum of the earth. I watched the output hose. After a few seconds of sputtering, a thick, dark plume of water shot out, cascading downhill into the forest. The draining had begun. I stood there for a moment, letting the noise of the pump anchor me. The red glow in the house window seemed to dim slightly, flickering in response to the massive loss of moisture I was inflicting on the underlying water table. The thrumming didn't stop, but it became weaker, more desperate. It was working. But then, the retaliation began. It didn't come from the house. It came from the ground. I felt a sudden, sharp, almost electrical jolt through my boots. I looked down and saw the earth around the pump. The red, ferrous soil began to move. Not cracking, but crawling. It was a slow, granular shift, like dry sand flowing upwards against gravity. But it was happening to dense, wet earth. Within seconds, small, dark, mud-like tendrils began to snake out of the disturbed soil right next to the running pump. They weren't roots or worms. They were formations of pure, sticky, iron-rich mud, animated by the same pulse. They stretched towards the pump's fuel lines, moving with a horrifying slowness. The sleeper was trying to stop the flow. It was using its own body, the red earth, to choke the mechanism. I grabbed the crowbar. I had no illusions about fighting the entity itself, but I could fight the mud. I swung the crowbar hard, smashing the largest tendril. It didn't break. It simply splattered, releasing a burst of that overwhelming sulfurous ozone and wet iron. It reformed instantly, thicker and more aggressive, wrapping around the base of the pump. I frantically kicked at the smaller tendrils, trying to keep them off the critical components. I had to protect the fuel line. If the pump ran out of gas, I would have to refuel, and I knew I wouldn't survive being exposed that long. More tendrils emerged, faster now, coiling and climbing over the base of the pump's engine. The pressure on the house, however, seemed to be holding the larger, shadowy projection at bay. It was a race against time, the pump draining the sleeper's moisture versus the sleeper's mud form choking the pump. The noise of the pump suddenly changed. It became strained, its aggressive roar turning into a sputtering cough. The mud tendrils had succeeded in winding tightly around the intake hose, squeezing it, restricting the flow of water. The pump was trying to draw liquid through a constricted opening, and the engine was struggling. I had to clear the hose. I threw down the crowbar, knelt by the pump, and tried to pry the sticky, dense mud formations off the thick rubber hose. The mud was intensely cold and unnervingly firm, like touching raw, chilled liver. As I pulled at one tendril, it snapped back, leaving a sticky, sulfurous residue on my gloves. The pump coughed violently again, and then, with a sharp, wrenching groan, it stalled. The silence that followed was instant and total, a massive, terrifying vacuum where the engine noise had been. In that silence, the house seemed to exhale. The frantic thrumming returned to its slow, massive heartbeat. But the red light in the windows intensified tenfold, bathing the entire clearing in an angry, pulsing crimson. The sleeper was not defeated. It was merely resting, consolidating its energy, and now it knew exactly where I was and what I was trying to do. I scrambled backward, knowing the danger was now immediate and profound. I had succeeded only in provoking it. I was about to run back to the car when I noticed a movement near the front of the house where the main porch sagged. It was the shadow, the spindly, tall figure, now fully visible against the crimson backdrop of the house light. But it wasn't walking. It was gliding, effortlessly, across the grass toward the woodshed. And it was no longer just a shadow. The red light emanating from the house seemed to catch and define the edges of its skin, if you could call it that. It was black, yes, but the surface was wet, glistening, and layered, like solidified oil, catching the light in 1,000 tiny, grotesque facets. And the head, the patch of raw red at its center, now seemed to have rudimentary moving slits, eyes, or perhaps sensory organs, focused directly on me. It was moving fast, faster than I could run back to the car. I had about 30 seconds before it reached me. I glanced wildly around the clearing. I was exposed. The pump was dead, the well was open, and I was holding a crowbar. My escape route was blocked by the creature's speed. I had to find a temporary refuge, something to buy me time to restart the pump. I sprinted back into the woodshed, slamming the rickety door shut and jamming the crowbar under the latch. It wouldn't hold against a sustained attack, but it might buy me 5 seconds. I stood panting in the darkness, the smell of ozone already infiltrating the shed's relative safety. Through the cracks in the shed's thin wooden walls, I saw the crimson light sweep past, followed instantly by a sound like a huge leather whip striking the wood. Crack! The shed vibrated violently. The shadow creature had hit the wall directly next to the door. I backed into the darkest corner, where Silas's long-forgotten tools lay. My hand brushed against something cold and cylindrical. It was a heavy-duty fire extinguisher, the old-fashioned chemical powder kind. Useless against a physical shadow, but the chemical agent, the powder, might disrupt the creature's composition, which was tied to the mineral-rich earth and ozone. The thing hit the door again, harder this time. The door began to buckle, the wood around the crowbar splintering rapidly. I could hear its wet, sloshing breathing just outside the door, accompanied by the low, continuous pulse of the earth. I pulled the safety pin from the extinguisher. The creature stopped hitting the door. A terrifying silence descended, broken only by the low, heavy thrum. It was listening. It knew I was armed with something new. Then, from just above me, through the thin, sagging roof of the woodshed, I heard the sound of those jointed claws scraping across the shingles. It wasn't going to try the door again. It was going to come through the ceiling. I looked up. The single, bare light bulb hanging from a frayed wire in the center of the shed suddenly, miraculously, flickered to life. A dull, weak yellow glow, perhaps the last reserve energy of the house, illuminating the shed. And then, I saw it. Directly above the bulb, the wood of the ceiling was darkening, swelling, and beginning to sag inwards under impossible weight. The wood itself was turning the color of wet, reddish-brown mud. I knew I had seconds. I raised the fire extinguisher, aiming it directly at the spot of the impending collapse. I had to risk exposing myself to the creature that was still outside the door, but the thing coming through the roof felt like the more immediate and heavier threat. The ceiling burst open with a wet, tearing sound, and a massive, black, mud-covered appendage descended. It was thick, cylindrical, and ended in a blunt, grasping claw, dripping the ferrous earth into the shed. I pulled the trigger of the fire extinguisher. A violent, white cloud of chemical powder and foam erupted, blasting upward into the ceiling hole. The mud appendage recoiled instantly, not from pain, but from rejection. The chemical powder, the dry, sterile counteragent to the sleeper's moist, organic existence, caused the mud to hiss and melt slightly, recoiling in a stream of dark, smoking liquid. The light bulb, which had been flickering frantically, exploded with a loud pop, plunging the shed into immediate, absolute darkness again. I didn't wait. I turned and rammed my shoulder into the splintered door. The crowbar flew loose, and I tumbled out into the clearing, gasping for breath, the shadow of the house and the crimson glow overwhelming my vision. The sound of the retreating appendage and the angry hissing from the hole in the roof was still ringing in my ears. I ran back toward the dead pump. The mud tendrils were still tightly coiled around the intake hose. I had to get it running again. I grabbed the crowbar and smashed it against the base of the pump's engine, not in the hope of restarting it, but in the desperation of trying to force it back to life. Nothing. I looked at the fuel tank. Full. The problem was the choke. The sleeper had caused the mud to clamp down on the intake, creating an airlock, a hydraulic nightmare. I had to disconnect the hose, clear the mud, and reconnect it, all while exposed in the angry, red glow of the clearing. I threw myself against the pump, working blind by feel and the faint, red light. I found the connection point of the hose and began wrenching the fitting loose. The connection was tight, rusted. I pulled, straining every muscle in my back, while listening for the gliding sound of the shadow creature returning. The rhythmic pulse was getting louder again, calmer, almost satisfied, as if it knew the pump was defeated. I pulled with one final, desperate effort. The hose ripped free with a metallic screech. As the hose separated, a rush of cold water, mixed with thick black silt, exploded out of the pump opening, covering my face and chest. The relief of the release was momentary. The pump was now disconnected, and in that brief silence, I heard the shadow entity. It was close. Too close. It was standing at the edge of the woods, right where the red glow met the darkness of the trees. It didn't glide. It simply appeared. A vertical rift in reality. 7 feet tall, its raw, red surface pulsing in the gloom. I knew I was out of time. I couldn't reconnect the hose now. I had to use the pump as a weapon, a final, desperate act of destruction against the source. I grabbed the heavy crowbar and swung it hard, not at the creature, but at the gas tank of the pump. Clang! The cheap metal buckled. Fuel, gasoline, began to leak instantly, pooling on the wet, ferrous earth around the pump, mixing with the mineral-rich mud tendrils. The sulfur smell intensified, competing with the sharp, clean odor of the gasoline. The shadow entity hissed, a sound like pressurized steam escaping, and it took a step back, the red patch on its head flickering wildly. It reacted to the danger of the fire. I needed ignition. I fumbled in my pocket for my lighter, a small, cheap, disposable one. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped it twice. The shadow lunged. It covered the distance from the woods in a single, impossible stride. Its long, spindly arm shot out, not toward my head, but toward the fuel leak. It was trying to smother the gasoline with its dense, wet body. I found the lighter, flicked it once, twice. Nothing. My hands were too wet, too cold, covered in that slick mud residue. The creature's body was now covering the pooling fuel, absorbing it, trying to render the gasoline harmless. Its black, wet surface was trembling. On the third flick, the tiny flame caught. I didn't hesitate. I threw the small plastic lighter with all my remaining strength. It tumbled end over end, landing squarely in the center of the fuel-soaked mud that comprised the creature's lower torso. The explosion wasn't massive, but the ignition was catastrophic. Whoosh! A sharp, violent burst of orange and crimson fire erupted from the ground, engulfing the lower half of the shadow creature and the pump engine in an immediate, intense conflagration. The fire roared, instantly vaporizing the pooling gasoline. The resulting sound was not a human scream, but a terrifying, deafening geological roar. The sleeper's pulse below the ground went utterly silent for a split second, replaced by a massive, grinding sound as the ferrous rock in the subsoil seemed to shift violently. The creature, the tall shadow, did not burn. It retreated, dissolving into a plume of hot, chemical smoke that smelled overwhelmingly of scorched sulfur and ozone, pulling the fire with it. The entire pump, fuel tank and all, was consumed. The drainage hose was burnt, the engine a white-hot ruin. The fire was intense, blazing with unnatural speed, but it was confined to the immediate area around the well. I stumbled backward, blinded by the heat and the smoke, tripping over Silas's old sledgehammer. I fell hard, hitting my head on a root, the world spinning in a dizzying array of black and crimson. When the spinning stopped, the fire was still raging, but the intense heat was already starting to cook the wet earth around the wellhead. The mud was cracking, drying, turning into brittle reddish-brown flakes. The fire was draining the moisture, forcing the sleeper to retreat deeper. to conserve itself. I had won the battle, but lost my tool. The pump was gone. I stood up, wobbly, the metallic tang of blood filling my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. The thrumming had returned, but it was weak now, a faint, wounded beat deep in the earth. The angry red light in the house was also almost gone, reduced to a feeble, distant flicker. The confrontation had forced the sleeper back. I had to leave. I had pushed my luck too far. I ran, staggering back to the safety of the car, driving away with the image of the fire, the black smoke, and the vast, terrifying silence of the wounded sleeper filling my rearview mirror. I drove out of the county and found a large city hospital, presenting myself as a victim of a rural house fire, getting my minor burns treated, and lying about everything. The doctors diagnosed me with severe exhaustion and mild concussion. Now, 3 weeks later, I'm hundreds of miles away, sitting in a rented room, surrounded by Silas's journals and maps. I'm safe for now. But I am fundamentally changed. The sleeper is not dead. It is dormant. I had wounded it, dried out its local feeding ground, and forced it to retreat into the deep, wet, ferrous rock. But I can still feel it. The thrumming is still here. It's faint, a tiny, almost inaudible vibration in my chest, a constant echo of the great, geological pulse. It's no longer coming from the earth, it's coming from inside me. I'm an antenna now, permanently tuned to its existence. I check the news obsessively for any sign of strange geological activity in Maine, for reports of disappearances, for anything that suggests the sleeper is stirring again. I know it's just a matter of time before it starts to heal, before the rains return to the coast, before the moisture seeps back into the red earth and revives the ancient heart. I have all the documents, all the evidence, and the terrifying knowledge that I am the only person who knows what is buried beneath the salt wood. I have to finish the job. I have to find a way to deny it moisture permanently, to complete the drainage that Silas only dreamed of. My fight is only beginning, and the entity knows my name, knows my warmth, and now it knows my location, carried to it on the faint, residual thrumming in my own body. The question isn't if it will follow me, but when it will surface again, and whether my own frantic pulse will be its final, fatal metronome. 6 months. 6 months had passed since I abandoned the coast of Maine, yet the coast never truly left me. I was living in a sterile 4th-floor apartment in a nameless Midwestern city, far from the red, iron-rich earth. But the thrumming was my constant companion. It was no longer a pulse in the ground, but a cold, rhythmic vibration deep within my sternum. A secret, terrifying metronome counting down to an unknown event. I became obsessed with the journals of Silas. I didn't just read them, I inhabited them. His descent into madness was my blueprint for survival. I learned that the sleeper wasn't merely harmed by the lack of water. It was the loss of ferrous moisture, the iron-rich soil that made up its organic body, that forced its retreat. My fire attack was a desperate success because it flash-cooked the mud around the well, creating a dry, sterile void. But the rains would come. The water table would recover. I had merely bought time. Silas's final, desperate, and never-executed plan involved creating a permanent, anti-organic seal. Not just sealing the pit with a lid, but filling the entire central cavity of the basement with a material that would not absorb water, that would actively dry and harden the very core of the entity. The required material, a highly specialized, fast-setting, low-water concrete mixture laced with a potent, inert drying agent. I spent those 6 months researching, gathering, and preparing. I sold the last of my meaningful possessions to afford the heavy equipment and the specialized chemicals. I leased an industrial van and disguised myself as a geotechnical surveyor. I was no longer an academic. I was an undertaker for a god of mud. The journey back to Maine was a waking nightmare. As I crossed the state line, the internal thrumming began to intensify, throbbing harder against my ribs. The sleeper knew I was coming. It wasn't tracking my presence. It was tracking the link I now carried. I was moving toward it, and it was reaching for me. I arrived near the saltwood at dusk. The house was a silhouette of skeletal, broken timber against the gray sky. The red glow was gone, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of a structure that had been gutted from below. The back porch was a ruin, and the woodshed was a charred husk, but the open wellhead stood like a tomb entrance, now half filled with rainwater. My plan was simple: drive the van as close to the house as possible, set up the industrial mixer and pumps, and flood the basement pit with the quick-setting concrete slurry. I had less than an hour of work time before the mixture would solidify in the equipment. As I began unloading the heavy bags of cement mix, I noticed the smell. It was back, but stronger, purer. Not just sulfur and ozone, but a suffocating scent of hot, wet soil and stagnant energy. The earth was recovering faster than I had calculated. I set up the mixer and started the generator. The sudden, violent roar of the engine was a welcome sound, a mechanical counterpulse to the oppressive thrum. I tossed the first bags of the sterile mix into the tumbler, adding the pre-measured water and the chemical catalyst. The process was agonizingly slow. Then, I heard the sound from the house. It wasn't glass breaking or wood splitting. It was the sound of something large and soft moving across the ground floor, directly above the basement. A squelching, dragging noise, punctuated by the faint but unmistakable sound of water draining away from a heavy form. It was exiting the basement pit, having healed enough to venture into the ruined structure. I looked up. The single remaining pane of glass in a downstairs window was reflecting a deep, angry crimson light. Not a flicker this time, but a steady, judgmental stare. The sleeper was fully awake, and it was staring at the source of the mechanical noise. The shadow, the spindly projection from before, was now redundant. This was the entity's full core presence. I focused on the mixer, pouring bag after heavy bag. I had to create enough slurry to fill the entire footprint of the basement. The generator strained under the load, screaming in protest. Suddenly, the ground shook, violently enough to knock the metal crowbar off the mixer. A massive, jagged crack appeared in the earth, running from the house foundation directly towards the running generator. From the crack, the red earth erupted. It wasn't mud tendrils this time. It was a massive, wet wave of reddish-black, iron-rich sludge, animated by pure, malevolent force. It surged out of the ground, moving with impossible speed towards the mechanical heart of my operation. I abandoned the final bags of cement. The mixture was ready. I grabbed the massive, flexible pump hose connected to the mixer and dragged it towards the ruined house. The hose was heavy, filled with the sloshing, thickening concrete, but adrenaline made me strong. I reached the cracked foundation and shoved the hose through a gaping hole in the sill, aiming blindly down toward the center of the basement pit, the source of the pulse. The wave of red mud hit the mixer. It didn't just stop it. The mud wrapped around the generator and the tumbler, squeezing them instantly. The metal groaned, twisted, and imploded with a sound like crushing rock, followed by a total, final silence from the machinery. I had maybe 30 seconds before the concrete in the hose would start to set. I stood there, exposed, holding the hose, pouring the liquid death into the pit. The house reacted. The entire structure seemed to groan, leaning inward. And then, from the hole where I was pouring the slurry, I saw the true face of the sleeper. It wasn't the shadow, and it wasn't the mud wave. It was a vast, hemispheric dome of pure, glistening, wet blackness filling the basement cavity, rising slowly, almost playfully, toward the floorboards. It was the heart of the pulse, radiating intense cold and an overwhelming sense of ancient, inhuman awareness. It was utterly massive, filling the entire space, a mountain of silent, organic iron. I screamed, not from fear, but from the raw, overwhelming force of the thrumming, which now exploded from my chest, echoing the entity's geological roar. I could feel the sleeper reaching into me, trying to pull the life, the warmth, from my body. I kept pouring. As the concrete slurry hit the surface of the black dome, the reaction was immediate and deafening. A massive hiss arose as the chemical agent met the organic iron. The top layer of the dome began to smoke, to bubble, and to violently recoil. The dome lunged. A massive, sludge-covered appendage shot through the floorboards right next to the hose, aimed not at me, but at the concrete. It was trying to stop the flow, to scoop out the toxic sludge. I backed up, emptying the last, thick ounces of the mix down the hole. I dropped the now useless hose. The entity's roar was no longer geological. It was the sound of millions of tons of pressure being released instantly. The entire house exploded inward. The foundation shattered. The walls collapsed into the basement, and the air filled with the dust of wood, iron, and chemically treated concrete. I dove behind a large boulder in the yard, covering my head as the final section of the roof fell with a terrifying crush. Silence. After the dust settled, the silence was absolute. The mechanical noise was gone. The pulse, the deafening, terrifying thrumming was gone. The metallic ozone smell was gone, replaced by the acrid scent of dry, setting cement. The salt wood was no more. In its place was a crater, a pile of rubble centered around a smooth, dark, quickly hardening plug of gray concrete. It had poured itself into the empty spaces and set, creating a massive, permanent barrier around the entity's heart. I stood up, trembling, my ears ringing in the void. It was done. The sleeper was entombed, denied moisture, denied access to the upper soil, sealed in a chemical coffin deep beneath the rock. I had succeeded where Silas failed. I walked away from the rubble, not looking back. I found my truck, drove until dawn, and abandoned the surveying gear in a different state. I never saw the coast again. I am safe now. The sleeper is gone. The world is safe, thanks to the desperate acts of a terrified academic. But the thrumming remains. It's no longer loud. It's no longer angry. It's not a metronome counting down to the end of the world. It's a whisper, a faint, cold, constant pressure in my chest, a reminder. I check it every day. It's flat. It's lifeless. It's quiet. But every now and then, when the air is damp and the rain is falling heavily outside my sealed apartment window, I feel a faint, terrifying shift in the silence. The pressure increases slightly, a mere fraction of a beat, as if the cold, hard mass of concrete hundreds of miles away is merely a shell, and the pulse is just waiting for the world's oceans to rise high enough to kiss its resting place again. I stare at my chest, listening to the tiny, faint echo of the earth, wondering, did I kill it? Or did I simply become its cage?